Hello everyone and welcome again to this September talk in our Charlotte Mason Centenary programme series. My name's Faye Morrissey, I'm the manager and curator at the Armit Museum, and this programme is jointly run with the Armit and the University of Cumbria for the special centenary of Charlotte Mason, who passed away in 1923, and we're celebrating her life and legacy 100 years later. I'm delighted to be here once again with Margaret Coombs, who is the author of Charlotte Mason, Hidden Heritage and Educational Influence. And Margaret did a little talk for us earlier in the year, but we're back again to pick up the story. And so I'm delighted to, first of all, ask Margaret, what happened with Charlotte Mason when she arrived in the Liverpool Birkenhead area?
Well, here we are when Charlotte and her parents both arrived in Birkenhead. I think they chose to move there because of relatives, and both Joshua and his wife were beginning to become quite ill, but also the other aim was to get some schooling for Charlotte. I think her parents had taught her how to read and read her exciting books, but in order to have a career, she needed a more formal schooling. So she joined the local church school, which was all schools were. She joined the local church school and began as a pupil. But it was very interesting moving to Birkenhead, because Birkenhead was the first city that had a public park. And I like to picture that Charlotte Mason walked with her step-brother-in-law in the park, because he knew Darwin, and I always imagined that perhaps he told her about the plants that she was so enthusiastic about once she got to Ambleside and founded the PNEU.
So perhaps that's why she was so into her natural landscapes and the outdoors later in life.
Well, that's what I rather hope, but we know very little about Edwin Burchell, but except that he had that enthusiasm.
And so what about church life? Because we know Charlotte was really into, obviously, her Christianity and faith. So what about church? Did that have an impact here?
Well, the National Society for building churches was an Anglican society, so that most of the schools that they were, obviously people had to be Christians, and Charlotte would have attended Holy Trinity Church in Birkenhead. It's a very peculiar building with odd sort of rails and coloured splashes of colour in the church. But that's where she would have attended every Sunday, and probably taking the children along with her.
So did the church have a school? Is that where she started learning?
Yes, well, the schools were all run by the church. And so the school that she went to was a church school. I don't have a name for the school. But the vicar was the Dr. Joseph Bailey, who was a former Quaker, who would have known some of her half-brothers in Ireland. But he was a very determined Anglican, and he was very important, very, very keen on supporting not only church life, but educational life for people.
So in this picture here, he looks a quite austere gentleman, don't you think?
He was a very determined gentleman. And I think, he not only did he work very hard supporting the schools that had been founded, but he also did an interesting thing which probably would have interested did interest Charlotte greatly, which was founding St. Aidan's College, which was a particular theological college for men who had not had undergraduate education. And so it was open to a much wider range of people. And Charlotte told her friend Lizzie later on how much she'd enjoyed what she said, going to St. Aidan's Church, but she would have been referring to the college.
I see.
St. Aidan's Church as such. She said it was in Liverpool, because of course she never wanted to reveal that she'd spent time in Birkenhead, because Liverpool was more respected.
So do we think that Holy Trinity was kind of the starting point for Charlotte on her journey into her educational philosophies and ideas?
Well, it certainly was a starting point in her education. And when you look at the syllabus of what the children had to go through at school, you realise must have been a very bright person to pass all of her exams. And she had to pass all the yearly exams until she was allowed to become a pupil-teacher, which meant even more exams at a higher level, including all sorts of scientific subjects and mathematical subjects, as well as literature. Very demanding to us now, I think.
Gosh, wow, it sounds like quite a time. And so what impact do you think Mr. Bailey had on Charlotte?
Well, she doesn't refer to him, but it may be part of her need to be secret about being in Birkenhead. But she clearly was interested in getting on with clergy, and indeed had some very good relationships with clergy later on. But whether he would have been a very busy, rushing about sort of person, so whether he had much time to talk to her, we can't tell. But
So who
preaching.
So who would it have been, Bailey teaching her, or would there have been other people around her?
Oh, he started a Sunday school. I should have mentioned that. Whether she attended the Sunday school, I don't know, but he certainly started a Sunday school.
Fascinating. And so what happened from the point of the Holy Trinity? How did Charlotte move forward from there?
Well, Charlotte would have continued to attend the church until she moved to London, when she went to the Home and Colonial College.
But
First of all, she had to qualify to take the Queen's Scholarship examination, which was taken in London. So she knew she was going to sit that exam when she left Birkenhead.
So how did she get to sit the exam? Did she have to have passed certain other exams before, or was it just an entrance application?
Well, all the exams she took every year, and then there were pupil-teacher exams every year too. So I imagine that covered quite a lot of the material. It's very, very wide-ranging exam, the Queen's Scholarship. Mathematics, arithmetic, literature, and she and her later great friend Lizzie, they both failed the drawing competence.
Oh dear.
That I think was a sort of add-on extra. So yes, I think by then she probably was reading quite a lot of books, and her father would have helped her with that. Of course, her parents by then had died, well before she took this exam.
So obviously the Home and Colonial Training College, or the Ho and Co, as it was known, was her next step. So can you tell us a bit about perhaps what she experienced there?
Yes, so she had to travel to London and to sit the exam there, and the Ho and Co asked the older students to look after the incomers, and so she was lucky enough to have Selina Healy, who was a second-year student, who looked after her and became quite a friend, as we'll see later on. And that is the only picture of the Home and Colonial College we could find. Of course, the key thing about it was founded to perpetuate Pestalozzian principles, which Charlotte later would say had no relation on her work, but she learnt a lot from the Pestalozzi and indeed a bit of training in Frobel, and it was a very precise training, very much checked with lots of checks and balances.
So what is the Pestalozzian way? For those who don't know, can you explain a bit about that?
Well, that is about starting with the child and seeing what the child wants to learn about. It's quite complicated.
Sounds very much like what she was trying to promote, though, so I can see why she tried to pass it off as her own, perhaps.
And instead of sort of telling children what to do and what to learn, you watch to see what children want to learn. And that, of course, is something that Charlotte certainly took on into her own work when she founded the PNEU. Start with the child was born. So although she denied being influenced by Pestalozzi, I think that was a crucial underpinning of her ideas.
So what would Charlotte have experienced at the Ho and Co if I just move on to this next slide?
Well, I think she got on well with the Home and Co. It was very demanding training. You had to take lessons and you had to do all sorts of things. But by the end of her first year, one of the things she found very difficult was, I should be talking about, they had a lovely playground, which was quite unusual in those days. And they allowed the children to move about freely, which was good. But at the end of her first year, the students were tested in a number of different ways, but this was a request for her to teach in front of her her colleagues. And I think Charlotte was so unsure of herself still that she felt very threatened by teaching in front of colleagues. So she burst into tears, and Mr. Dunning, the very experienced training master, whom Andrew Clough described as an excellent training master, but rather over-religious, but he thought that tears meant a sign of illness, and so after some time it was decided that she would have to leave the college because she was ill.
So was it not down to her own wishes? Was it down to somebody else? That's interesting.
Her wish, it wasn't her wish to leave, but poor Charlotte had nowhere to go, so she stayed in college through the vacations, really alone. Nobody asked her to their house. So I think she probably was quite depressed, and then felt very threatened by some of her colleagues. Many of them would have been right. So she collapsed, and it was decided by the authorities that she ought to move on.
However, do you think she would have been, well, obviously she would have been disappointed by that, but would it have been looked down upon at all for her to have had her training cut short?
Well, I think she would have been very embarrassed about it, because her best friend Lizzie, with whom she kept in touch for the rest of her life, she stayed on and was able to take the certificate. You had to have the teaching certificate at the end of your course. Right. So as Charlotte had to leave early, she had to take her certificate later on, and I can talk about that in a minute. I think she would have felt upset about that, but she did feel very threatened by competition, I think.
Right. And so what happened after that?
Well, interestingly enough, although she wasn't able to finish the course, somebody decided to appoint her as the first mistress of the first college in Worthing, and the first children's college in Worthing.
And this is a rather nice picture of the Worthing ladies here too.
So she was invited to go to Worthing and to be the mistress of the William Davison School. It was one of the first infant schools, which I should have made clear. And here is a picture of Worthing. Now, when Charlotte arrived, although she may have lived on the Isle of Man with her parents for a while, she was too terrified to go to the seaside for quite some weeks.
Oh, gosh.
So perhaps if she went and saw those ladies enjoying themselves, she might have run a mile. But the great thing about being in Worthing, away from London, was it was a very healthy place to be. Lots of sea air, and she was very strong and healthy through most of her time there.
What did she actually suffer from? Do we know in present day terms?
Well, we know, people thought she had heart trouble throughout her life. I had the remaining prescription studied by an expert, and he found nothing there for heart trouble. So I think quite a lot of it would have been nervous tension. I mean, she'd get the normal coughs and colds and things, but I think nervous tension would have frustrated her. But she was hardly ever ill in Worthing, so the air must have done her good. Yes.
That's good. So tell us a little bit more about Worthing and her time after the Ho and Co.
So it was a healthy climate, and she was the first mistress. Now they were infants, and there were a large number of infants in one of these schools with a sort of gallery, so you're teaching a very large crowd of children, which must have been very difficult. The school was managed by the vicar, the Reverend William Reed, who was quite elderly, but he was very understanding of Charlotte. And he had a daughter who helped him run the school, and she was also indebted to both of them for guiding her forward in what she was doing.
Would she have been teaching all subjects or certain subjects? What was her remit?
All the sort of basic subjects. And in due course, the school decided they ought to take in older girls, and that came in several years later. And they had a separate room in the classroom. I mean, the really difficult thing was the children longed to come down and sit on the benches where they could write at a desk, but they were sort of piled up in this gallery. Nowadays, we never do that.
No, different times.
In what was teaching and others, you know. But these older girls, later on, I have to say that Charlotte then described this older girls team as an independent girls' school that she'd founded, which wasn't quite the case.
Oh, she's twisting the truth, is Charlotte.
That school was actually founded in 1928 after she died. However, that school still exists, and they acknowledge Charlotte as their first headmistress.
Oh, very good. So she's still got her name put down there.
Perhaps a lot of people didn't think you could teach older girls anything.
Maybe not, but she showed them anyway. So she was at Worthing, and how long was she there for?
She was there from 1861 to 1873, so quite a long time.
So she must have learned quite a lot in that time.
And she found Mary Reed, who was a model of efficiency, very helpful to her. And it was in 1864 she made her first visit to Ambleside and met with Selina Healy. Oh gosh, that's when the photograph is.
So here we go. I'll pop the photo of a young Charlotte on the screen there now. And I think that's one, if not the only young picture of Charlotte to be shown or that we know of.
Yes, and that was taken in Ambleside. I can't remember the name of the photographer, but he took it at Ambleside during her visit to Selina Healy. And it's a very charming photo, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. I think she looks like she's got a very friendly and approachable face, which is always what you want.
And what was so nice for Charlotte was that she was getting a salary, and by 1868 she was receiving £65 a week, which was quite something in those days.
Mm.
And the other, so she went on teaching the girls, but going to the church with the children, she met a whole lot of higher class people and learned, I think, to speak their language. And one of the important people she met was a Miss Brandreth, whose father was quite a famous person. And she used to look after the children of her brother. Her brother and his wife were working in India, and so she would have the children to stay. And Charlotte, when she made friends with Miss Brandreth, visited her when she was teaching the children. And I think that was her first example of how home education could be given within a family setting. And she found that very interesting. And I think that would have set her thinking about the future when she eventually founded the PNEU.
But what happened after the long stint at Worthing? What happened when her time at Worthing came to an end? What happened?
She was beginning to get a bit fed up with it and was looking for other jobs and other work. And she did have some ideas about founding some sort of new kind of educational thing. But in the end, after applying in various places and seeking Mr. Dunning's advice, she was successful in being appointed to the Bishop Otter Training College as a senior governess.
Oh, so she's moving upwards in the world.
Upwards and learning how to treat adults. And she made several quite close friends from among the women who were learning how to teach there.
So was this quite different, do you think, to what she was doing before in Worthing, or is she benefited from doing bits with older pupils?
Yes, Worthing was hard work because she had to have evening schools as well. And of course, with such a large number of children, there were other teachers there, but not very many of them. But it was very hard work. Mind you, when she went to Bishop Otter, that was also very hard work because they were short-staffed. Perhaps that's for another occasion to discuss that.
I think lots of people watching will probably know about feeling short-staffed in the current climate, but we won't go into that either.
Yes. So she did have a lot of energy. She only had one sort of period of illness during her time in Worthing. And she did very much enjoying being there. And it definitely raised her standing as a much higher class person than she perhaps thought she was when she started out.
So at the Bishop Otter, she's become senior governess. What does that mean?
Well, it really meant a lecturer, but for some reason you called governesses in those days.
And how long was she at the Bishop Otter? What happened?
Well, she was there for 4 or 5 years, and then it all got to be too much. And she had rather hoped. She had travelled abroad with Miss Brandreth, and she had rather hoped to perhaps live with Miss Brandreth for a time, but that relationship broke down, and so she had to fall back on. She did try one or two things, but she had to fall back on going to live with her friend, who is now Lizzie Groveham, who lived in Bradford.
And we know that name.
She had started to write before then, and she produced about, I think it's 4 or 5 volumes of geographical readers. So that was for people teaching in school. And they've never been sort of widely acclaimed, but I think some people found it quite useful. So that was her first essay into writing.
Right, I see. So we're now almost at the point of her coming to Bradford and meeting or seeing Lizzie again, and approaching the PEU, later to be the PNEU then, I guess.
Well, she was invited. Well, Lizzie knew her very well and knew her ups and downs, but she was invited to share the teaching. Lizzie had started an independent girls' school, and Charlotte was invited to share in the teaching of that school. But Lizzie also left her time for writing, so it was at that point that she wrote Home Education, which was the launch of the launch pin of the PNEU.
Yes, definitely. And that basically took things off for Charlotte from there. Do you want to talk a bit about that at all?
Well, I hadn't planned to.
Oh, maybe something for another time then. Watch this space.
Might be a good idea, yes.
So we know that Charlotte's had quite a difficult, I suppose, early life, as we talked about in the earlier talk in this year, with her upbringing, her father, her mother, not things that she talked about in later life, something that she kept hidden, as you suggested about Birkenhead. So she's had to go through quite a lot of challenges then, Charlotte.
And needing to keep so many things secret. I mean, she was secretive about her mother being a Roman Catholic, and she never revealed that her father had been a Quaker. I don't know that she ever knew that she came from such a tremendous Quaker heritage, because James, her whatever he was, great uncle, and her great grandfather John were born. Well, they were born in Cumbria, and they both went to school in Kendal. So they were very much local Quaker lads who then went to Ireland and set up schools and taught, and were very and wrote books. But I don't think she ever knew about them, which is rather a shame.
No, so you don't think she actually knew about some of her Cumbrian links, funnily enough, ending up in Ambleside?
Yes. But it's rather curious that she should choose to set this up at Ambleside when she had that background that she didn't know anything about.
Absolutely. Perhaps there was something deep down subconsciously that she reflected on in terms of her Cumbrian background that she didn't know.
And of course, she was a Victorian, and sort of class was, being in the wrong class was such a handicap, really. You had to be so very careful.
Absolutely. So what other challenges do you think she had to go through?
Well, just literally the hard work of teaching under those circumstances and having to keep going without really a very supportive people to live with, because in her last year she stayed with a teacher who died at the end of the year. So she had a very tough time there. But she did manage, when you think about it, she had so little background and didn't get on with her second half sister. But she did manage to do all the work and pass all the exams. That's quite something, isn't it, really?
Definitely.
And so she had a strong drive and a dedication to do things. She certainly developed that.
Do you think she had any difficulties with the sort of, the world was still very much run by men? Do you think she came up against difficulties there?
Well, she learned how to deal with men very cleverly. She was always sort of quiet. She developed a very quietly spoken voice, and she was always very courteous, and she got on with the amazingly different men. She got on very well with the education person in Bradford, Thomas Rooper, who liked her ideas very much and had read, when she'd written 1 or 2 books, she'd read those. And she got on with the maverick Oscar Browning, taught at Eton, and then founded a college in Cambridge. So she learnt, I think she must have learnt to have that touch, and she did always speak in this very quiet, pleasant voice, and presumably lost any sort of accents that might have been unsuitable.
Do you think she, as you've noted about her being secretive regarding her early life, do you think she sort of repressed that, or why would she have kept that a secret? And that must have been challenging for her to not really share that part of her life with anyone.
I know, and not apparently having the need to talk about it, because all being cousin Huldah Jane, she did meet Charlotte once or twice, but Charlotte didn't search out for any of these relatives. She cut herself off from them, and kept very quiet about it. And she built up other friendships, people who didn't know about it. And of course, as you may know, once she got to Ambleside, there was an absolute rule about not questioning her about her past. And so she was always read to, because that's what Miss Mason wanted. She managed to get people sort of fitting in. And I think she just was terrified of the thought of people finding out about her background, which nowadays we wouldn't trouble about, I don't think, just admire the skills she developed. But she was a Victorian, and with those, rather neglectful, regrettable Victorian attitudes, I think they never left her really.
What about any challenges she came up against towards the ideas and the educational approach that she was taking? So we've talked about the Petzolottian principles. Was what she was developing particularly radical? Was that challenged?
Well, yes, she didn't like to be challenged at all, and found that quite difficult. There's the famous situation a bit later on where the Lady Isabel Margeson decided that the PNEU should include all sorts of strands of educational theory, and there was that's a story in itself. There was quite a battle, but Charlotte managed to win and to beat this aristocratic lady. Was quite, I'm sad. I was always sorry to hear that Lady Isabel Margeson went on to found another organisation teaching Froebel and Locke and other people, but did die in a very sort of disappointed state, which is a pity. But so she was, you wouldn't have thought it, but she was a very tough cookie.
So what do you think it was about her that made her so strong and was able to overcome these aspects in her early life, which, you know, for a lot of us in the present day, she's gone through losing her parents, having to drop out of a training course, moving around for ill health. You know, what was it in her, do you think, that kept her going?
I think she must have somehow kept herself going very well. I mean, she had methods like being read to distract her from worrying things. But I think about that phrase that she used so much, which started as I am, I ought, I can, I will. And I was going to entitle it that, because that was her. I am, I ought, I am, I can, I will. It's got changed to I am, I can, I ought, I will.
Just swap round.
That was her mantra, really, because I can do it. But she did need people to help her. She didn't found the PNEU on her own. It was essential to have Mrs. Tyneful supporting her with all the contacts she had. But she knew how to find people who would help her. And of course, she did have a gift for friendship.
Definitely. I think she's such a fascinating character. And from my point of view, I love looking into people's lives and their own stories. And I think it's a great job that you've done to look into her early life and to find out these things that obviously she tried to keep hidden so well, perhaps until now.
Yes, I mean, when I first met her, I found her sort of slightly sickly person, but not at all. You know, that would be grossly unfair. And it is amazing what she went through, and it's sad that she didn't feel able to link up with any of her, you know, family's descendants, and her, you know,
So that's Margaret's book there, Hidden Heritage and Educational Influence. So before we round up this talk, Margaret, is there anything finally that you'd like to remark about this period of time in Charlotte's life during which she was doing her own teacher training?
Well, I think she showed a lot of sterling strength in passing all these exams, and without really too many people backing her and saying, well done, Charlotte, and being able to cope with going off to London, perhaps waved off by one or two friends who gave her books on the way, but having to go off alone and then getting through college, having to stay. I think she was the only person who stayed in college during the vacations. Putting up with all that must have taken huge strength. And so perhaps not surprising that she was quite glad to leave college and go into another life where she was staying in jolly lodgings and having some money to spend.
Yes, and so obviously we know that all of this culminated in her being able to put in place the House of Education, and so it all led up to that, really, didn't it?
Yes, and then being able to follow that through. I mean, in actually starting the PNEU and taking on the scale how as the House of Education, that took tremendous courage, and she didn't have any money really. I mean,
yeah, that's
know,
always a fascinating thing to me, is how did she get the money that she did? But it must have come from the books and the articles and things that she did.
Well, I think people supported her. She got people to believe her, and of course the later friendship that we haven't got talked about now with Mrs. Netta Franklin. The Franklins were tremendously rich, so there would have been some support from there, and other people did find money to help her. For example, when she was setting up the PNEU in Ambleside, I can't remember her name, but I think it was Mrs. Parker, funded taking on Springfield House, which is where they started. So she was very persuasive.
Fascinating. Well, I think that's a great place to leave it, at the tale of Charlotte's early life, because then we can pick up the rest of her lifetime through the House of Education, through our exhibition at the Armit, which is on here until the end of 2023. And you can come and visit the site and see Scale How, which is now part of the University of Cumbria. So I just want to say thank you so much, Margaret, for speaking with us today. That was absolutely fascinating to talk about that early part in her life. And thank you to everybody as well for listening today. I hope that's been a useful insight, but it would be remiss of me not to mention Margaret's book once again, Hidden Heritage and Educational Influence. There it is on the screen, modelled very nicely. We do have copies of it available in the Armit for purchase, so do come along and see us. So thank you once again to Margaret, thank you to you all, and hopefully we'll see you at the next talk series next month. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Faye, and thank you for listening to us.